All right, we are live, waiting for Tiago to join us for this productive conversation today. I'm really excited to finally have this opportunity to speak with Tiago. I am a fan of his work. I had a chance to chat with him at the World Domination Summit back only a few months ago. We'll finally get to meet in person. I've got his book here uh, on the Kindle. It is, of course, his now best-selling book, Building a Second Brain. So if you're watching this live, let me know in the chat. Tell me that you're here. Say, hey, I'm here checking things out. If you're watching the recording, I'd love to hear comments from you and things of that nature as we get ready to kind of dive into this conversation today. This episode will air not right away. In the public, for the public. It will air sometime in October. I think the plan right now is October 12th. But for members, of course, you're going to have access to this right away. So we'll have the recording, which of course is here. The raw YouTube video is right here. And then, of course, the actual recording will be inside of the Circle community. And Tiago is with us now. So let's just get in here and welcome Tiago Forte to the mix. Tiago, it's great to see you.
Hey, Mike.
We've gone live for our members. I like to get on a little bit early because I haven't tested the whole Zoom to YouTube thing in quite some time. I was using Riverside before, and it's good to see you. It's good to see you. Glad that this connection worked because I was a little concerned about making a shift at the last minute, but I'm glad I did. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. You too. Happy to be here.
So the way this is going to work, and people who are watching this live, again, it's TimeCrafting Trust Premium members that are able to catch this live, so they get this raw video experience kind of thing, is we're going to be recording this for a podcast episode that's going to go live. Like I said, probably, I think it goes live to the public on October 12th. So right now they're getting the whole, like, let's talk behind the scenes kind of thing as we prepare to record the episode. We only need about 45 minutes or so overall. So I know we booked a whole hour, I think, but we won't need all that time. We do have some questions that people ask. Some asked via Twitter. Some of them have been asked from my membership community. I've got, of course, a whole slew of them in my, what I would call a waste book, but we'll get into the talk of waste books and commonplace books and things like that as we make our way through the conversation. But when we get started, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit record on my little trusty Rodecaster Pro here. We always have the guest introduce themselves. So you have a line that you have to say. So it's I hope you're ready for it. It's legitimately, hi, state your name, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy. And then we're off to the races. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right, I'll give you the countdown. 3, 2, 1.
Hi, I'm Tiago Forte, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Tiago, it's so good to have you on the program at long last. I mean, this is something that I've wanted to do for a while, and we were able to make it connect and make it happen. Thanks so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. I've been following you for years and years, and we met in person at an event in Portland a couple of months ago, and this is the continuation of our discussion.
Which, by the way, you knocked it out of the park on the main stage. I don't think I had a chance to we didn't run into each other after you spoke. I think you were there was a lot going on. Plus, World Domination Summit 13 years ago, because I mean they did take a couple years off. I think it was 12 years ago or whatever, and then they came back for the 10th one. Mike Vardy was able to hang at the late night party until, but by the time that the this one was done, I was like, okay, I'm gonna stick around for a bit, say goodbye to some people, and take off. But we never had a chance, and I just want to say yours was a fantastic talk. I'd had read elements of the book that you convey some of this in the book as well as the story. But a mutual friend of ours, Mike Pacquione, was asking, like, how did Tiago? I'm like, Tiago killed it. Like you knocked it out of the park. So I want to make sure that I got that out of the way right out of the gate. It was a great talk.
Thank you so much. That was one of my, I mean, definitely, maybe probably the biggest talk I've done. I was sweating bullets. But looking back at just the friendliness of the crowd just was so encouraging.
It was my two favorite parts I'll go with the one that was like the funny part was the Apple Apple apologist level stuff that you had to do on occasion, which we get a lot. It's funny. You use Circle as well for your memberships and your courses, and I use it as well. And that's the biggest thing that they're saying right now is, where's the Android app? Where's the Android app? And we're like, we're not as concerned about that to a degree. I'm glad that they're working on it. But I mean, that was funny to kind of say, like, yeah, I don't know what your Android note-taking apps or whatever. I've actually tried to expand my knowledge on it, but it's hard. The thing, keeping up with apps on iOS and Mac alone are challenging. But the thing that I really liked, that kind of, I loved the way you were able to bring what people can understand to the mix when you were talking about the second brain, idea, the extended mind, which you bring up in the book as well. But this idea of the second brain, where you said, we have all of these prosthetics and these other things that enhance other parts of our body. Like, I wear these glasses, I wear progressive lenses. If I don't wear these, I can't see, right? So we have those, but you brought up that we don't really have those for our brain. And that was like, that moment I thought was the moment where everyone kind of leaned in a bit more. You know what I mean? Because I don't think anyone's really thought about it that way, but you clearly have.
Yeah, we have prosthetics for every other part of the body except the most important one, the mind. It's just very strange. It's a very strange situation.
It to me, that was one of the aha moments as I started to go through just the idea of personal knowledge management. And then when we get into the second brain component specifically, one of the things that I mentioned to you when we talked was the idea that building a second brain, which I have right here on my Kindle. I told you that this was like, for where we're at now in the productivity space, and for in knowledge management, all that productivity comes up in here as well. But the idea, this to me was like what David Allen was doing for productivity. Building a second brain, this book is going to be the one that does it for this particular space. And I think it's already shown that. I mean, you're a best-selling author at this point. The phenomenon is growing. When you started to put together the second brain concepts, was this in your wildest imagination that things would get to this level?
Was not. I just went on Medium one day to rant about how much I hate tags one late evening. That was the extent of my ambition. And then one thing literally led to another. And it took me years, it took me several years to finally have the light bulb go off that other people were looking for this kind of content. And eventually they got me to see that it was worth dedicating some real effort to. I honestly can't believe that one little random Medium post all these years, 6-7 years later, has led to a book, a course, a whole business I'm trying to build around it.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And again, most things start with a itch you're trying to scratch, right? And tagging is something that comes up a lot. It drives me nuts that we still live kind of in a folder-based world, right? You know what I mean? Like, we live in, because that's the way we were taught in the analog sense, right? Like, you got a filing cabinet, you put the files in the file folders, and they're very objective, right? Like, this means this, and the way tagging works to me is it's very subjective and it connects things. It's the same thing when you use a task app like Todoist, using labels for those modalities that you need cross-section across projects, which are very objective, right? So if you're thinking, I only have 5 minutes to do something, let me look at all the labels that have 5 minutes attached to them. Oh, look, I can move 8 projects forward. Like, that's the way our mind is designed to work, right? It's designed to think in those modalities, in those subjective ways rather than objectively. Why don't you think tagging is caught on as much as maybe it should? I mean, I'll give an example, Mac OS, right? Like, the Mac OS system has tagging. How many people use it? How many people, Apple is, I don't even think, really magnifying or amplifying the use of tags in their OS. Why do you think it's such a tough nut to crack in the general sense?
I think it's just way too labor intensive. I actually did research on actually, Mike, hold on one sec. I have a little
Sure.
device here making some sound.
That's okay.
I don't recommend putting a washing machine in your office.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. My kids are home from school today. It's a professional development day, so I'm live streaming from 1 to 2. It's a podcast. It's going to go live, and so my daughter's like, "Well, my friends are coming." I'm like, "Don't ring the doorbell." Like, there's all these little things, but yeah, probably not a good idea to put a laundry machine in a place where you record.
I thought I was being so clever in fitting that in here, and no, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, there's certain kind of things you can't tandem task in the same location. So yeah, like I mean, again, back to the idea of tagging. I mean, yeah, labor intensivity is definitely a huge part of that, right?
Yeah, I did some research on where tagging came from, and it really came from this era, like in the 70s, when computer time was you paid for it or you reserved it by the minute. There's all these stories of like people would go, students, computer science students back in the 70s, 80s, they'd go into the library and they would plan their searches and their computations like on little note cards. They would pre-think it and really plan it out and strategize, because once they got into the computer room, they wanted to be able to feed in those cards, get the results as fast as possible. That's actually the origin of tags. It was basically computer time was more expensive than human time. So you spent a lot of human time to save the computer a little bit of time.
And it's flipped. It's flipped
Now it's
now.
flipped,
It's
right?
completely flipped.
Now you want to
Wow.
use a lot of computer time to save you even just 1 minute of human time.
Well, and I think that the connectivity of a tag helps because your brain is, I mean, at least for me, and this is the kind of stuff I teach when we talk about like working by modalities and using tagging, because you and I are on the same page with this completely, is it it connects things in a far more human way, because you're not thinking, and I'll do this with people a lot. I'll say, um, would you wash your dishes in the bathroom? And they're like, no. I'm like, but could you? Well, yes, I could. I go, but you don't, right? Because you wouldn't. And by the way, there's more places to wash your dishes in the bathroom than in the kitchen in most
That's
cases,
true.
right?
That's true.
Bathtub, sink, toilet, if you really want to get desperate, of course, in the upper tank, right? But in the kitchen, there's generally only a couple places. Maybe the dishwasher, but then the machine's doing it, or the main sink. And they're like, well, I'm like, well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, we don't do that there. I'm like, so the bathroom is meant for these things. The kitchen is meant for these things, but dishes are, you could in a pinch, in a kitchen reno or things like that, do that. So if you start to, and that's why I appreciated about during the talk where you said the prosthetic for your brain, that's why I think where this kind of these breakthroughs happen. I wonder, and I'd love to hear what the feedback you've got from the book in terms of, has it been like, do people say this seems like a lot of work? This seems like really challenging. Very much like getting things done. David Allen faced that too. A lot of people are like, hey, you know what? It's a short book, but man, is it a deep book? Like, and if you've gotten that feedback, what are your challenges to the reader, but also to yourself to try to make it a little less onerous, let's say?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that. I've always heard that. This is a particular approach to productivity that is not sort of a collection of different tips and tricks. It's a system, right? It's a kind of holistic, pretty comprehensive, integrated system that you're creating, which I think is what makes it powerful, is what gives it leverage. But it also means there's a hump, there's an activation energy that you have to get over, a certain amount of time that it takes before it starts saving time, right?
Yep.
It's definitely, I think, one of the main concerns across this entire landscape of like productivity systems, tools for thought, second brains. And so there's different ways to kind of alleviate those concerns. I mean, first I'd say it's not necessarily for everyone.
Right.
If you just don't have the scale of challenge you're trying to overcome, the complexity of problems to solve, the volume of information, there's certain like situations that a second brain was built for. But also what I really try to do in my teaching and my coaching and all that is to find just these simple initial use cases. People shouldn't necessarily like try to like write the next great American novel as their very first project.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And they
They-
shouldn't jump in all at once. I mean, that's the other thing. What I appreciate about the second brain, model, system, framework. I mean, it's all those things. The approach is that, unlike many systems, you don't have to try to do it all at once.
Mhm.
That was one thing I appreciated. And I think that's emerging in the systems and frameworks that are coming to life over the last, say, 10, 15 years is, you mentioned the book, the idea of novel in public and then timeless in private. That timelessness is something that needs to be built upon. Like it's a slow burn, or maybe even just a slow adoption. And bit by bit, you add these things to the mix until, you know, it feels as frictionless as possible. And I think people are more amenable to that than the whole, you know, well, all right, I've got my book now. I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this, you know, 100% or 150%. And then all of a sudden something small doesn't work. And then the whole house of cards falls apart. The way that Second Brain's built is that I haven't found that flaw, that Death Star like kind of flaw where it's like we overlooked that. I haven't found it there, which I think is a testimonial to the kind of work you put into this.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. I think that's exactly right. It's like, you know, because this system is personal, it is unique to you. It really is only being used by you. It shouldn't be highly engineered. It shouldn't be highly, you know, linear and highly and rigid and all those things. No one else has to interact with it. You know, note taking can and therefore should be messy, informal, a little chaotic, a little idiosyncratic. Those things are all perfectly fine, and that's what makes them resilient, right? It's like rigid formal systems cannot withstand change. Therefore, most systems that actually stand the test of time in our personal lives have to be informal.
It's interesting because when I was on the Bear and Fig podcast a couple years ago, Joey, I was talking about time crafting, and he said it sounds really rigid. I'm like, it sounds like that to you because it's not. You can't. My brain works that way. Your brain does not work that way. You know, my brain will automatically go from, I wake up in the morning, what day is it? Okay, this daily theme means this. Oh, wait, I've done all the things that are for that daily theme. Okay, how do I feel right now? Okay, I'm kind of tired. What do I do when I'm tired? They're like, well, why would you put all that there? Why wouldn't you just do what's next on the list? I'm like, because that is what's next on the list based on and it's the same thing, right? I mean, I think that we've been taught that to work in this very linear, you know, quote, efficient, and I mean, there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down around that. But it's, again, we're I think that the bill of goods we've been sold is there is an objective way to do things, and we must do it that way. How hard is it for someone to break free from that and work subjectively? And what maybe are some of the things, if someone wants, again, that quick, you know, invite to the subjective way of you know, working and thinking and collecting and learning, and we're going to talk about code here in a minute. What's one like kind of trigger that you find can get people to go, oh, wait a minute, okay, I'm gonna try a little bit more. I'm gonna dig into this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, in my course, what I have people do is pick one project. Pick one project that is a bit challenging, that is a bit complicated, but that is important, that finishing it with less time and effort and stress than would normally be required would actually be meaningful. And then to focus on that completely. You know, like in my situation, the first 3-4 years that I was doing this stuff, the only thing I was trying to manage was my health condition that I talked about in the book. It was my second brain, which I didn't call it that at that time, was just a medical record management system. So I got to completely focus on the needs and the constraints and the goals of managing my, you know, my patient notes. And then for another year or two, it was just to keep my head above water in my first professional job, working for a consulting firm. And then a couple of years after that, it was only ideas for my blog. And then only after like 7-8 years of this did I start to realize, wait a minute, this is actually a general purpose problem solving tool. It can encompass my entire life. But if I had started there, it would have been completely overwhelming. You can't just instantly boot up an entire life management system, especially one that you copied wholesale from someone else.
Well, I mean, let's use the example of the new iOS that came out. My wife and my mother-in-law are not the most tech savvy of people. They can opt, but they don't like the change. So I'm getting ready to upgrade them, and I'm like, okay, you can go to 15.7, and right below it says upgrade to 16.0. I'm like, this is going to be thrust upon you at some point anyway. So do you want it to be thrust upon you while you've got somebody here that knows a bit more about what this is going to look like, or at least can be the sounding board when you bitch and complain about the fact that things aren't where they were before? Or do you want to wait? And both of them were like, first their instant reaction was like, ugh, why do they always, and so that happened. And and then it was like, fine, do it. So that way, like the Band-Aid's ripped off, right? I think that when they have a guide or someone to kind of help navigate them through, or they have, they can make those choices, they can work with it, but they're not going to go deep into all of the elements of what iOS 16 has to offer. They're not going to add multiple lock screens or anything like that. They just want to be able to get back to where they were. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people, when they try to adopt new systems, new frameworks, especially when they confuse it, they want to achieve, right? They're like, I want to get things done. This system will help me. Evernote's a great example, right? Like using a tool like Evernote. And I know you still use Evernote, right? You're still heavily, right. Evernote, when it came out, gosh, how many, 15 years ago, easily. I know I was one of the earlier users, and I still have my Evernote account. I tend to use it as a digital filing cabinet more than anything else now, which, I guess is to a degree, the forebearer of, what is going on now with PKM. But, people would download Evernote and then they would load it with everything, everything. And then they'd go, well, this is a mess. I'm like, well, yeah, all you did was move a disorganized pile from one to the other. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of working on one project, and it was a massive project. Like, patient notes are not nothing. Mm-hmm. Patient notes are like, there's a lot there. Mm-hmm. When you finally had that, that mea culpa, or that epiphany of like, wait a minute, this is a general purpose system. What was your hesitation to go all in? Was there any? Was there any hesitation to say, I don't know, this is still not fully baked? Like, was there anything like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the big hesitation was my methods are so simple.
So something was wrong.
Yeah, it couldn't be, like Para, which is my organizing system, is 4 folders. Mm-hmm. Create 4 folders, put everything in those 4 folders. People can't believe. And I almost felt embarrassed, to advise, elite, high-end knowledge worker professionals to implement something so simple. Progressive summarization is highlighting. Intermediate packets is just breaking down your projects into small pieces. It's all practically common sense, in my opinion.
That's the thing. Yeah. Oh. And you're right. I think that this idea of complex equals smart, equals like sophisticated. I mean, Joyce here, for those that are listening to this episode, of course, we've recorded in advance for TimeCrafting Trust Premium members. Joyce, who's a lifetime premium member, saying she loves code, with the code process. She loves Para. Like, she's using that stuff, and she's doing stuff that's got a lot of layers of stuff, of complexity. But if the system, to your point, I think that's the thing. If the system has a simplicity to it, it can manage things that have multiple layers. But I think people get it backwards. It's like, well, the system has to be really complex so it can handle anything. And that's not timeless. That's the novel, right? That's the novel stuff. And frankly, we've seen that stuff fall by the wayside more times than not.
Exactly. It's so tempting to go after something impressive, something new. It's like the very same people who are voracious readers. They learn for fun. They watch documentaries, not because they have to, but because they want to learn stuff, tend to be curious, novelty-seeking people by their nature. And so that same seeking of novelty applies to their tools, and they tend to jump around from one thing to another. The true purpose of a second brain system is to completely fade into the background. Yeah. Like the same way, imagine a painter who's in flow. By definition, they're not thinking about, what length of paintbrush and the kind of bristles on the brush and what kind of canvas. All those implementation details have to fade away for you to really get into flow. And I think it's like digital tools have been so full of friction and cumbersome for so long that we don't even have that expectation or hope that they could really fade into the background. But they that's like I think this is one of the big messages kind of like lurking in the background of my work is I really believe knowledge work is an art form. Mm-hmm. It's a creative medium, like painting, like music, like dance, like sports. It's not the modern equivalent of the factory worker on the production line just mindlessly, hammering that thing or screwing that screw. And if that's true, imagine if that's true. We have to think as artists, as creators, as craftspeople at many more subtle levels than we've been prepared to.
Well, and the other thing is that we can manage knowledge better than we can manage time, because time moves on whether we want it to or not, right?
That's a great
So,
framing.
right. So, and this actually leads to a really interesting question from Eric Colby, at Eric Colby on Twitter. He says, I understand productivity and PKM are different. Can you discuss the difference, both in terms of where they are mutually beneficial and where they are most distinct? I think that's a nice segue into that question, because there are some threads between productivity and PKM, but they're not one and the same.
Yeah, I'd say there's strong overlap. And I think PKM would, at least the way that I do it, would be solidly in the umbrella of productivity. But I would say, as for differences, it's sort of like we're passing a couple thresholds. I think one threshold is that before now, it was like there was a battle between analog productivity tools and digital ones. You could kind of say, oh, you can go one direction or the other. And now it's like, you can't ignore software. You just can't. It's become too powerful, too pervasive, too connected to everything, too easy to use. If you're not leveraging software, you are living in the 20th century.
Yep. Or earlier.
Or earlier. And then B, really all of us have to use both. Right? This idea that you have to like pick one. I'm going to have a digital note-taking system or a paper note-taking system. We all have to deal with paper and software all the time. So it's like, what is the overarching set of principles? Like, what is the overarching set of principles that is agnostic to platform, agnostic to paper or digital, that just work, that are timeless? And that's what I've tried to introduce.
It's funny, because as we talk about the idea of analog and digital, I'm literally looking at my Baron Fig. I call this a satellite notebook, because it's literally nothing permanent goes in here. It's kind of, again, you talk about commonplace books in the book. There's waste books, which has also come up. I think it was what's the late German really short guy. Gosh, I wish I could remember. Lichtenberg, I think it was.
Oh, okay.
He had waste books. It came up in the book Soon, a book on procrastination, which is absolutely phenomenal. He basically kept a lot of stuff in waste books, but never actually did much with them. So that's the point, is that this is literally, these notebooks here, these tiny ones, ultimately end up somewhere I trust, for long-term storage. But what's funny is that I trust these to get them there. So it's all about trust. And a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I'm either an analog or a digital. I'm like, we're all hybrid, like you mentioned. Like, they all are part of it. But we live in a world that really likes it's either this or that. And I think that's what's another piece of friction for people adopting things like tagging versus foldering. Both have their place. Same thing with the framework you've built, which, frankly, there's no one right absolute way to do it. You've given some codification to it. You've given some structure, but within that structure, there's lots of room to play, right?
You're giving me so many ideas, Mike. I'm kind of wanting to turn to the side here and take some notes. I like how you just said codification. I should use that as a thing, like to put your work into code, into my code framework, is a codification of that.
I think we're living in a world of no code right now, right? There's a lot of people talking about, look at Notion. The reason Notion's taken off, I think, is because it allows people to do so much with it. Evernote had the same thing. Notion has to be careful to not fall into the same trap that Evernote did, which is we don't know what we are. So that's the other thing too, is that we have this weird dichotomy of it's either got to be this way or that way. But if we don't, if we try to be too wishy-washy about it, if we try to go, there's no absolute middle. There's, there's a leaning, and you kind of lean whichever way the situation or circumstances require, which is why, again, great example. If I'm you and I are sitting having a coffee, I'll probably take notes in this notebook rather than on my phone for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm writing down, there's a good chance I'm writing down something that you've said that resonates.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm using my phone, I'm connected to so much more. For all you know, I'm texting my wife or I'm writing an email, right? So there's some decorum pieces to this too, that where paper might make the most sense in that moment. But then how do you make sure that it gets from here to the final quote resting place or place of incubation? This gets into code, right? Like the capture process. So I think that there's something there too, right?
I found the same. I used to take detailed notes on my phone, tablet, or computer because I was like, oh, I want to be able to search this, tag it, all that stuff. And then I had the same realization that actually, when I'm with someone in person, what matters is my presence. What matters is that they feel listened to and respected. What matters is that I'm there with them, as human beings. And so even though it's not optimal, it's not, the ultimate solution, I have also started, or some time ago started taking paper notes, and then I just digitize them afterwards, take a photo.
Well, and now you can. The phone lets you do that, and it's copy paste. And actually, I'd argue that it is optimal because you're now servicing the right relationship. You've just had how old are your kids now? You've got
I have a 2-year-old.
Yeah. So this will be a great example. As somebody who has raised now, we've got an 18-year-old and a 12-year-old. When I go to the park, this comes out if I have a note, not a phone, because then the kids see, oh, dad's not really here. He's checking his phone, da 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 da. Whereas if I'm pulling out a notebook, that's just what dad does.
Interesting.
So
I'm gonna use that.
right? So it's the same thing. Boundaries with kids are really like the idea of right now. I've used this since my daughter was like 4, and my son has always assumed this. I have a hotel door hanging thing on my study door. If the door hanging thing is on, it means Mike's in, like, don't knock, don't do anything, keep quiet, something's going on in here. If the door's shut, you can knock. I'm probably doing something, but I'm not doing a coaching call or I'm not having a podcast. Door's wide open, come on in. So it's, again, this codification, right? Like, this is what this is, right? Like, they see this notebook. My phone is in my pocket just in case something happens, but I've also done things like custom ringtone or vibrations. If it's a regular ringtone, I don't know who it is. If it's a regular vibration, I don't know who it is. But if it's a specific vibration, so for example, my wife's is the Imperial March, but I mean, nonetheless, it's what it is. So I know what I'm like, oh, that's my wife. I better get that. And what's hilarious about that is I know to answer that. I ignore everything else. And yet people around me, I'll be like, oh, I have to get this. It's my wife. How did you know? Like, I took a moment and prepared that. And this is what, like, the friction point initially is the preparation, is the setting up, is the capturing. And one thing that when I heard you speak about it, and then I read in the book, Capture What Resonates, I want to clarify that to a degree, because my thing has always been capture everything, regret nothing. If you capture it, yes, you're capturing noise, but you get to filter that out later. How challenging is it for someone when it's the resonance? How do you decide? How do you understand, okay, is it a muscle? Is it something where you're like, I'm going to capture everything until I get that habit down, then I'm going to capture what resonates? Like, how did that work for you? Because I can tell you, I'd be afraid to, like, oh, I didn't capture that. I might want that later. It may not resonate now, but it might be connected to something later.
It's a great question. So I think the reason that I sort of settled on that and give that advice is, I think it's important that people use note-taking to get in touch with their intuition. A lot of people use note-taking to not have to listen to their intuition sometimes. It's like, let me just, I guess, write it all down. Whereas I really think to avoid that sort of digital dumpster effect, like when you save too much, basically the problem is down the line, you're creating extra work to have to process, digest, filter. And that's where people really get stuck, is when there's just too much of it. So I'm trying to have people be more selective about what they keep, but using sort of their intuition, because here's the thing, if you make capture too analytical, if you have, like, some people want like a 10-point checklist, the exact criteria, to me, of the 4 steps of code, capture is the one that kind of it doesn't really add that much value. It's kind of just like you just document it, you just save. The real value comes in later steps, especially like distill and express. So
Right.
I'm trying to have capture be automated, have it be minimalistic, as little as possible, and to have it be that kind of system one, that little intuition, that gut check, rather than this very highly energy intensive analytical process.
So let's use an example. I've caught myself capturing things multiple times the same thing if I
Mhm.
write it down in this notebook,
Mhm.
which to me is a signal. This
Mhm.
is clearly important. It's bothering me. It's you know, what have you. And then it goes to either ClickUp or Todoist if it's a task. If it goes to, I'm still trying to figure out what software I'm using for PKM. Obsidian looks nice. Napkin. There's a whole bunch of different options, which again can cause paralysis for a lot of people. But in your instance, what you're saying is, and I can definitely get behind this, is if you don't capture, if you capture what resonates, but something keeps coming to mind
Mhm.
that you haven't captured, then
Mhm.
that's clearly showing that it resonates in some way, shape, or form. So
Absolutely.
you definitely want to get that down. It's not just like the I want to go to Bali and then you just leave it alone and all of a sudden it comes back up again. You're like, well, wait a minute. I've thought about going to Bali at least 3 times in the
Mhm.
last 6 months. Why haven't I written it down? Right. So I
Absolutely.
better get it out of my head. Right.
It's a great rule of thumb. If it keeps coming up, often it's those kinds of things are prompted by something in the environment. You may not even be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Some little trigger, some little thing that reminded you of that idea. So the idea is persistently in your head. It just needs something in your environment to kind of trigger it or provoke it. And it's a sign that it does resonate with you. You keep noticing it. You know, the million things you could pay attention to, external or internal at any given moment, if your attention repeatedly is getting caught by that thing, it's such a good sign.
One of the things that I've done is because it doesn't just show up maybe once every week or two, or once or twice a week. Halloween decorations. So as we're recording this, we're getting ready for Halloween. Years ago, I put into my task management system,
Mhm.
put up Halloween decorations, and it's a recurring task that shows up again and again and again. Why? I don't want to have to think about it because
Yeah.
it's an external environment. Like when do I think about it if I didn't have it there?
Mhm.
The first time I'm walking in the neighborhood and I see somebody with her Halloween decorations, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, right. Or, and this is what Costco does and did and still does very well. If you ever shopped at a Costco, you know that in July, Halloween stuff starts showing up.
Yeah.
Why? Because no one's they're competing against no one at that point in time. There's no attention people are giving, and others have started to adopt that model. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I have, where Target's now bringing stuff out way earlier, and Walmart, like other businesses, are going, well, wait a minute, we want to make sure we get their attention sooner as well. So now all of a sudden, Costco's putting Christmas stuff out in August with the hope that they're going to get your, because someone's walking through, they're going, you know what, we need new Christmas lights. I better buy them now. And so now they're in a position of, I'm going to make that decision and do it now, as opposed to, hey, every November 1st, I want to start thinking about putting up Christmas decorations, or I want to go shopping for Christmas decorations, or whatever. I think there's some instances where you capture once and then you can kind of, that's the organization phase, right? That's actually the remaining elements to a degree, but the organization part for sure.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it kind of brings up this bigger point too, which is if you don't do this stuff, which in a sense is like structuring your environment,
Mm-hmm.
structuring your behavior, structuring your time, structuring your informational surroundings, other people are going to do it for you,
Yeah.
right? Companies, marketers, ads, they're not, it's not this free, you know, level playing field out there of just nothing going on. It's like you either do it for yourself or someone else is going to structure your life for you.
And if you do it habitually enough, like let's say, so for right now, Halloween is a big deal around our household, at least for the next few years. But then
Mm.
after that, it's not.
Yeah.
So if I remove it from a system I trust and Halloween's coming around, I'm like, wait a minute. I know I removed it. It's no longer of value or important to me. It's no, Costco can't tell me to buy Halloween decorations because I'm like, we don't do it anymore. So it almost works both ways, because I can tell you when my kids are no longer trick or treating, there's a good chance that our lights will be out on Halloween, at least until the grandkids come around or something like that. Or maybe not. But it's nice to have again, it's agency, like you're talking about. You're taking ownership of it. And that's kind of what, I mean, with the second brain, that's what that is in a lot of cases. It's you're having ownership over your ideas, your thoughts, your insights. And so you're not as corruptible to a degree of what's coming at you, vying for your attention elsewhere.
Totally. That was a beautiful, return back to the second brain theme. It's really true. It's really true. There's a line between reminding yourself to prepare for Halloween and Christmas and reminding yourself of, that brainstorm you did a few months ago, reminding yourself of that idea to improve your product, reminding yourself of even stuff like, one of my favorite notebooks in Evernote is Christmas gifts. I am not a natural gift giver. I, left to my own devices, I would forget everyone's birthdays and Christmas all the time. And so I just made a notebook where every time I come across a good gift of any kind, I just put it in there. And every time I have to buy a gift, which is usually at the very last minute, right before the birthday, right before Christmas, I have this, it's almost like a ongoing slow burn of a brainstorm that's always happening in the background. And as a result, everyone in my family and my friends think I'm an incredibly thoughtful gift giver.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have the same. I have, of course, I used to do this for the personal stuff. So I'll have in there, months in advance, buy birthday gift for so-and-so, or get Christmas cards are another one. If you don't send those out, I live on Vancouver Island, which means it's an extra day to get things off the island. And then it's Canada's a big country. Takes like a week to get across. So I'd rather, and then you don't want them to arrive you want them to arrive like by middle of December at the latest. So December 1st, that's when that task comes up. And what's interesting, and I think this is, again, a level of agency, is it doesn't say do Christmas cards. It says decide when to do Christmas cards. So it's even like that level of, okay, I'm not doing them today, but I'm going to draw a line in the sand as to when. Now that's a level of extreme that I take that maybe you wouldn't or somebody else wouldn't. But for me, it's important that my list doesn't say you must do this today. It's like, no, because December 1st last year was on a Monday, and Monday is not the day you do that kind of stuff. Instead, you do that on a Saturday. So you'll wait 5 days to do it. So then you just move it to, so it's this, again, it is flow. And back to what Joey said on the Baron Fig Pot, it seems really rigid. I'm like, for you, yes, you'd probably like, oh my goodness, like, why do you have to create another task that says do it when it's decided? I'm like, I don't create a new task. I just move it to that day. And my brain knows, oh, I've already decided, because that's what it was. That's the organization base. But distilling and expressing, I want to get to before we get to some final questions from people who are asking. And actually, I think this is a good time for this one because it's note processing, right? So Pierre Stanley Baptiste, at Pierre S. Baptiste on Twitter, asks, how does one integrate the habit of note processing in his or her life? He notes that you're a big advocate for using tags, which we've talked about. But how does he connect notes related to each other? Notes that are not part of, like, say, the same project or folder. How do you, can you address that?
Yeah. So the way I think of this is, in the paper world, you had to process notes because paper is so kind of hard to work with. It's so full of friction that you basically have to get the note that you originally captured, which was usually in some like dashed off, very cursory, form. What Lumen called fleeting notes, I believe. Like it was just temporary, basically. And you had to convert them into some evergreen format, I don't know, on a hardier stock of paper with a better title, with better handwriting, with this little, numbering system. That is all a legacy of paper. But with digital, first of all, there's a couple of things that have changed. First of all, we're taking so many more notes. Like many of my notes, I don't even have to take, they just appear. I use Readwise. So anytime I make a highlight in a book, I make a highlight in an Instapaper article, notes just appear in my Evernote.
And now the beta just got released to me like a couple days ago. So I'm like digging.
The reader app.
The reader. Yeah. They've got the Readwise. Readwise has their new app, right?
Yes.
So it's the reader app. Yeah.
So it's going to take off even more. There will be even more notes.
Yeah. And both, that's again, blessing and a curse, right? Depending on how you want to look at it. But if you have something you trust, it's not so much of the latter, right?
Yes. Yeah. So that's the first point, is the volume is taking off. So that processing, to me, I personally don't feel like I have the time for that. I'm not going to sit down each week and laboriously, one at a time, process, reformat my notes.
It's like the weekly review and getting things done. It's a pain point.
It's
a huge point. It's where people drop off.
Exactly. It's you know what it is? It's a lot of time and effort every week for very unclear benefit. Like, why are you doing that? For some unknown, far off future problem, right? So what I prefer to do, and this is the second point, is, once it's captured, once it's digital, it's preserved forever. Like, there's no such thing as a fleeting digital note. If it exists in the software, it is essentially preserved forever, synced across all my different devices. So the processing does need to be done to just translate it into your own context. But I prefer to get that ritual and just postpone it far into the future to the moment that I actually need that information, which is usually when I'm starting a project, trying to solve a problem, trying to reach a goal. It's like I'm putting the creation of the solution, which is that little bit of information, as close in time to the actual thing it's trying to achieve as possible, rather than processing way in advance and hoping that someday it becomes valuable.
Yeah, you're not projecting it. You're basically, letting it sit until it's needed, right?
Exactly.
And that's where tagging. So what tag would you use? What tags would you use to kind of illustrate that? Does
I
it
don't
even?
use I don't use tags. I'm not a fan of tags.
So you're
Uh,
not tag, even though that was your initial like railing point on Medium, the idea of tagging. You don't use tags at
oh,
all
it was
for.
against tags. It was a rant
You're against
against
it,
tagging.
right. So you don't use tags. Sorry, that was a confusion on my part. So you're missing tag. So the tags, in and of themselves, don't connect the notes. It's the fact that you're delaying the need to look at them until it makes sense. There's sense making involved here, right?
Yeah.
I wonder, see, for me, tagging is such an integral part of that because of the fact that there's a modality attached to a tag. I guess I've made tags meaningful. Maybe that's the key. Whereas there's no need for you to make meaning for them if they don't really serve you within the framework that you're using, right?
Yeah, I mean, this definitely speaks to why it's so important for each person to figure out their own system. But this was actually the last part of that person's question was connectivity.
Yeah.
So I wanna give my take on connections.
Yeah, because I'd go tags. So this is interesting because I'd figure out how you connect. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this is kind of the era we're living in. We're living in the connectivity age, not just the internet and all that, the web, but this whole generation of Obsidian, Rome, Logseek, Athens. There's like a whole crop of linked based or networked notes apps. So here's my take on this: is obviously connectivity is important. It's the very heart and soul of creativity and productivity. But in a funny way, it's like, to me, the linking that happens in one of those apps or with tags is far too rudimentary. It's
Right.
far too basic. Like, to say this node is connected to that node. Okay, well, that is not an informative thing for me to know, because it depends so much on again, I bring it back to the project I'm working on, the problem I'm trying to solve, the challenge I'm trying to overcome, right? Like, depending on the challenge, the whole set of connections in my second brain may not have any validity for the
Right.
particular thing I'm working on. They may all need to change, right? And
Mhm.
I can't predict what I'm going to be working on in the future. It will be something I don't even expect. Therefore, I prefer, once again, to wait to do all that connecting and linking, which is effort, postpone it into the future to the time that I actually need it. And I can do that because software is so good at this. You can create a huge number of connections almost just in time, in minutes, right in the moment that it's needed. That's my spiel.
So I want to touch on this before we wrap up. You mentioned Jerry Seinfeld and the idea of him capturing things, and that comes up. I Have you seen the movie Comedian, perchance, the
No,
one with him?
no.
And okay, so there's an interesting, because they both have him and another comedian named Orny Adams. It's from the '90s,
Uh,
and it's kind of like the following of each of them to see how each of their careers go.
mhm.
Obviously, you've never heard of Orny Adams, so clearly we know who won that one. But it's interesting because Seinfeld was almost all analog, and Orny was like using Excel to structure jokes and all that stuff. And I find, because I've done comedy and because I've done a lot of that stuff, is that comedians are often really good at, I mean, the idea of a joke is often, or a bit is like making the ordinary extraordinary, the extraordinary ordinary. That's where some of the humor comes into play, and observational and things like that. So Seinfeld pulling over, pulling out a notebook and writing notes down and things like that. The question that I find fascinating is, to your point about like when these ideas need to be reconnected or when they need to be connected at all, is for somebody like him, it's almost always happening. Like there's all like the primary brain is almost always drawing those connections to a degree. The role of the second brain, from what is almost to push it outside of you, so you can look at it from a more objective way, even though it's kind of the way that you're thinking anyways. Like, is that kind of the landscape that if someone was to think about it in those terms, that's kind of you're putting it in front of you to go, okay, let's see what's happening here.
That is a great observation. That is exactly how I'm thinking of it. Is like there's nothing the human brain, the first brain, does more. Like I can show you any two objects. Here's a LaCroix can and a coffee mug.
Mm-hmm.
What's the connection?
They're
You can come up with,
they're both vessels that hold liquids, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's lots of things. Both have caffeine, depending on what LaCroix is.
I can show you any two objects in the universe. The human mind will find some commonality, right? So what that tells me is A, we shouldn't use software to do something the human mind does completely effortlessly and intuitively. B, because we do it so intuitively, it's almost like I want to wait, not create all these very explicit connections. I want to be surprised. I want to like dive into my second brain with a specific thing I'm trying to accomplish and not have all these pre-made connections for me. Like those, I think, are just as likely to limit my thinking as to expand it.
Right.
And so it's really, I'm just kind of trying to have a soup of interesting ideas, almost free floating. No very hard associations or connections, just little groupings. There's a scientific principle called the small world property, which is that innovation happens when there's these little kind of informal agglomerations of ideas, right? Not hard walls or silos, but just little clouds, right? And I just want to kind of roam through those clouds with my current, need in mind and just see in that instant all the connections. Maybe I might make the connections in software, but I see very little value in doing all that work ahead of time.
I think the only reason that, to me, that would happen is if people are feeling overwhelmed and they don't know what to do next. It gives them something maybe to bank onto. So let me give you an example. Back to what I was talking about earlier about lower energy, high energy. If they are starting their day and they see everything, because that's what they're seeing is everything, and they are in a position where they don't have the capacity to make a choice about where they want to go, having something that they can connect with almost immediately, like, how do I feel? I feel tired. Okay. There's a jumping off point. Let me see everything that I want to see when I'm tired. I think that's a benefit, but you're right. I think it can be over-engineered. It can absolutely be. I think if we rely too much on that, then it becomes we've leaned too far the other way towards we're trying to be a machine when we're human. Right?
I think you're right. It is so important to have a task you can perform that adds value, but that you can do even when you're very low energy, like not at your peak. Because the truth is, you're not at your peak probably like 80-90% of the time. It's just by definition, the peak is the peak. So for me, that answer is progressive summarization, is getting into the content itself of like the body of the note. So this is an interesting distinction. Is stuff like linking is structure, right? It's almost like the webbing, the connective tissue in between notes. But I've had this experience time and again, which I think has informed my approach to this, of losing stuff, losing data, losing databases, having records corrupted, losing devices. Like I over 15 years of doing this, I've had so many of those. And so it's almost like it's interesting. The structure of a collection of knowledge is the most fragile thing, right? If you had to go from one app to another, it's like almost impossible that any structure is going to make it. At best, only the content will make it, right? You'll have these like data dump exports of like just the content. All the metadata is gone, tags are gone, links are gone, structure is gone.
When people hear I use two different task apps, they're like, what's wrong with you? Like, you're moving, but I'm like, well, the only way I'm able to do that is by going, this one is for this one is for this. That's the only reason. If I was putting work stuff in Todoist and personal stuff in ClickUp, everything falls apart. Like you said, it collapses, because now I can't trust it. It's the house of cards, right? You pull the one card out, or it's like the Jenga where, it's barely holding on by a thread. To your point, you're looking within the connective tissue, not so much the connective tissue, but the actual tissue itself. Saying like,
Exactly.
here it is.
Exactly.
This is what I find. And the fact that you break projects down
Mhm.
is huge,
Mhm.
because a lot of people, like Para does that. A lot of people, and we're seeing a lot more people talk about this idea of projects trying to disguise themselves as tasks,
Mhm.
right? Like the idea of, this is a project, or sorry, this is a task. No, it's not. It's a project. You need to break
Yeah.
it down. That's why you're not making progress on it, because you're trying to you're trying to eat the whole elephant
Yeah.
all at once.
Yeah.
You got to like pick and choose. And that's where I think you can find, to your point, those low energy things, right? You could do, project summer. Oh, okay. Someone was on one of our calls recently, and one of the low energy tasks for our focus fix session, they chose a low energy task of breaking down a project. And somebody on the call said, that sounds like it's a lot of work. I don't know if that'd be a low energy task, which illustrates your point about the personal component of it, how nuanced it is.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's it. That's it.
So as we wrap up, I want to bring it back to the timelessness of it, because Chase Turner, who's a member of TimeCrafting Trust Premium, asks the question, and it was a longer question, but I'm gonna kind of like the knowledge map arrangement, the arrangement of a knowledge map from 10 years ago. So the way things were done before, with software, with all the stuff, can it still work today? So do people have to necessarily adapt? Like when they were looking at the way things were assembled, the way they managed knowledge before, with all the different changes in technology and things like that, over the last decade, do they need, like, can they find solace in some of the stuff that still exists, or do they need to really think about, okay, well, this is going to change, or this has changed. I need to explore things like, the idea of a second brain. I have to look at the software a little bit differently, because, to your point, most of the software focuses on, look, you can link this. It's backlinks. It's all this stuff. And to your point, that doesn't do much unless you're doing something with it that requires the first brain to deal with it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we were, where we're at now, and then even further where we're going.
Yeah. This is something I think about a lot. I think about it a lot. I'm reminded of certain kind of amazing examples, like, who's the writer of Game of Thrones?
George R.R. Martin.
Yeah, George R.R. Martin. He uses, and still uses, as far as I know, or at least did the last time I saw an interview from him, a program called WordStar that was released in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he can only run it on like a Commodore or something. Like he has to use like ancient hardware to run this program.
It's like the free write stuff. It's like Astor House with their free write, like Hemming. Like I have it. I have a legitimate, like, all it does is I can write on it. It syncs to drive. That's it. No internet, no nothing.
Yeah.
This forced function, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's something that I see, which is there tends to be, as different generations of, let's just take writers, who are the heaviest users, I would say, of these systems, as different generations come up, they tend to adopt whatever is most popular when they're starting the first years of their career. And then they rarely, if ever, change. So like, it's really funny right now. It's amazing. Like right now, how many of the most successful writers in the world use Evernote? Tim Ferriss. I was just reading, I have so many examples in my notes I could look up, but they often use Evernote because the most successful writers right now in 2022 were starting to write, or early in their careers, like 2007 to 2012, right?
Yeah. I think he wrote the 4 Hour Workweek in Evernote.
I think so.
It's either that or the body, whatever the one is, the chef one. One of them he wrote entirely. There's a whole article about it. Yeah. It's pretty. You're right. And I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why, as much as I've been moving away from Evernote, it's hard because it's what you used. It's also hard to get things out of Evernote, frankly, but that's a whole other point.
Yeah, I think there's a generational effect, which to me says, what I take away from that is it doesn't matter that much. Like, it's like writing, especially, imagine two writers. One has more sophisticated, advanced, next generation technology. Are they going to do better writing? Absolutely not. That it's like, it depends on your profession and your field, I would say. Like maybe if you're a particle physicist You will make better discoveries if you have a particle accelerator that is like, the newest, latest, and greatest thing. But most fields are not. Most fields are not at the cutting edge, the frontier of technology, that their note-taking app is going to be the differentiator in their work.
Well, and often it's the experience and the wisdom and the maturation of the first brain, the person that's actually studied it, that's going to make the difference anyways. I mean, I've used this example with golf. Like, if I went golfing with the best golf clubs on the planet and went against my brother who's golfed for years, he's still going to kick my ass. Because I don't have the fundamentals down. I have the foundation. I'm not as good. I haven't practiced as much.
Totally.
So yeah, it's the tools. We know why tools get pushed. We
Mm.
know because they are easy to see. You can
Yes.
touch them. You can feel it. You can't like quantitative productivity is such a huge, massive thing, right? Because inbox zero, all these things, like I can count them, I can see them, I can therefore trust them.
Yeah.
But what you can't see is what goes on up in here, the qualitative stuff.
Yeah.
That's when you're bringing up, like, I go into, like, and I explore and I feel, and there's going to be some people like, oh God, how long is that going to take? Right. Because they can't measure it. There's no way to measure it. Right. Or at least measure it in a way that's objective. Like a business can look at it and go, well, yes, see, Tiago did this, and oh my goodness, look at the quality. But man, it took them. That's why I don't like the term slow productivity. As much as people are talking about this term now, I
Mm.
think that what's going to happen is it's going to turn slow into lazy, or slow into like incompetent, or they're not able to do it. Like it's like quiet quitting, right? Same jargon that kind of gets corrupted and misconstrued, not unlike inbox zero, which is not what it actually, this, I know
Yeah.
this. Inbox zero is not what it meant. That's a whole other conversation for another time, which we should definitely do again in the future. I want to be respectful of your time. Tiago, thank you so much for joining us today, especially in the live stream for those that were watching live. Where can people pick up the book, and where can people keep up with the work that you're doing, which is phenomenal stuff?
Yeah, I encourage people definitely to buy the book. You can find it at buildingasecondbrain.com. It's available through tons of different online and offline retailers, and coming soon to, I think so far, 20 different countries and languages. So if you don't read English, we have a solution on its way to you. And you can also find on buildingasecondbrain.com the course that I teach, the podcast, Second Brain Podcast, the blog that we have. There's tons of resources at every price point, including free. So take your pick of, which learning experience you want to have. I just encourage people. I think it's just what you said. It's like downloading an app is so clear. You can acquire something. You can just hit, download and have it. But the true transformation comes with the changes up here. And that takes learning. It takes immersion in these ideas. And actually what it takes is trial and error. It takes experimentation to find out what works for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We got people in the chat saying that they really enjoyed it. Thanks so much to everybody that's in the live stream. I'm going to end the live stream now. Then Tiago and I will wrap things up a little bit separately. So thanks everybody who watched the live stream. And end the live stream. Okay.